Hey everyone, it's me, Aaron. How are all of you doing? Me? Oh, just surviving, which is really the best any of us can hope for at this point. Yeah, so I'm gonna just lay it all out there for you guys. At the beginning of this year, I was not like all those memes that you see going around where everyone's like, oh, me at the beginning of the year, I was all happy, but now I'm sad. No, none of us were happy at the beginning of this year. We were all miserable at the beginning of this year, and I knew it was going to get worse. I could look around at everything that was going on in the world, and I knew 2020 was going to be a rough year. But even with my expectations being as low as they were, I still thought by the end of this year, we would at least have DC Comics. And the post office. Real talk, I'm a little bit more upset about the post office. I really did not see that one coming. But this isn't mail time with Aaron. No, this is Comic Class. And before we get into today's episode of Comic Class, I would just like to apologize to everyone because last week we did not have an episode of Comic Class. Why did we not have an episode? Because this is true. Last week, I was working on an episode. I had all written out and had begun editing it together. And the episode for last week was going to be on DC's over-reliance on Batman. About how there were too many Batman books. And about how Batman was in too many corners of DC's media empire. And then I got halfway through editing that thing when all of a sudden the news story broke that AT&T was going to make wide-sweeping cuts to DC Comics. Cuts that were so harsh, people were now concerned for the future of DC Comics. So, in case I was accidentally sitting on a magic monkey's paw when I was writing out that script about how there needed to be fewer Batman books, I apologize to everyone out there, but yeah, that's why we didn't have an episode last week. I decided to scrap that episode because, the timing just didn't really seem right. Didn't really seem like a good time to go, yeah, I know all that stuff is going on, but here are my complaints about Batman. Yeah, it just seemed a little bit tone deaf. So, you enjoy our video today as we try and break down everything that happened and what it could mean for the future of DC Comics. And I'm just going to be over here trying to figure out a way to make a phone call back in time to warn my earlier self about, this. Enjoy, everybody. Folks, the future ain't looking bright for DC, and believe me, no one hates saying that more than me. I've often spoken out about how so many times people in the geek media sphere of YouTube, especially the comic book corner, love to use doom and gloom and fear to get you to click on their videos, raising paranoia just to get views. But I can't lie, we're at a very ominous crossroads now for the future of DC Comics. You see, for anyone who doesn't know, DC Comics is a subsidiary of Warner Brothers Global Brands and Experiences, a division of Warner Brothers, a subsidiary of AT&T Warner Media, and oh my god, this video just started and it's already way too complicated. Point is, DC Comics is owned by AT&T, and after a year of many companies being hit hard by the COVID pandemic, AT&T made sweeping firings across each of their Warner Brothers divisions, and DC was hit particularly hard. So hard that news outlets described it as Bloodbath Monday. Side note, who the hell fires people on a Monday? That's not how this works. You fire people on a Friday. That's just common courtesy. But among those fired include Vice President of Talent Development Bobby Chase, editors such as Brian Cunningham, Mark Doyle, and Andy Corey, Vice President of Marketing and Creative Services, Jonah Whelan, Jim Lee's Executive Assistant, Eddie Choi, and even the Editor-in-Chief, Bob Harris. Yeah, these were not minor players. These were major figures at the company. Now, I'll admit that people have said for a long time that DC has needed an editorial shakeup. I mean, even I've said that some of the higher-ups at DC were kinda head-scratchers. I mean, Bob Harris was the Editor-in-Chief at Marvel when Marvel went bankrupt. So I always found it weird that he then became the editor-in-chief at DC right after that. However, when you look at many of the other names that were fired, it quickly becomes clear that this was not based on performance. In fact, there almost seemed to be no rhyme or reason to these layoffs.
Eddie Choi was spoken highly of in the industry. Many people who knew him said that he was one of the strongest employees at DC. Mark Doyle and Andy Corey were key to the creation and the operation of DC's Black Label line, which, yes, just to address what some of my longtime fans might be about to post in the comments, I have said numerous times in the past, I have problems with Black Label. But I'm just one person. It doesn't matter if I have problems with it when the rest of the comic book world loves it. Black Label has overall been a success for DC. So, of course, it was only natural that AT&T would fire the people responsible for this success. I'm sorry, what? Yeah, some of these firings almost seem random, like someone just said, okay, who are some people in high-ranking positions at DC Comics? All of them? Cool, fire them. But what if those people were doing good things for the company or responsible for some things that were a success? Nope! Researching something like that would take time and work. Better to just blindly send out pink slips. But we have this huge, massive online event that we've been hyping up for months and it's happening in a week. Shouldn't we maybe wait till that's over with to fire everyone? No time! In fact, here's what you're going to do. 3 days before that event begins, split into two by taking all the events dedicated to our comics and moving them to a later date.
Yeah, that actually happened. Wow, it's almost like someone crafted the perfect metaphor for all my fears for the future of DC Comics and then brought it to life. In fact, let's go ahead and address that elephant in the room because that's the real thing that everyone is talking about. People are afraid for the future of DC Comics. Not DC. DC is going to be fine. DC is going to continue to have movies and shows and video games based on all their properties that go on and on and on forever. No. I'm talking about the actual comics. People are concerned that when it comes to the actual comic book side of DC Comics, this could be the start of the end. Fortunately, Jim Lee was there to address these concerns. I'm sorry, I misread that in the script. What does that say? Oh, sadly, Jim Lee was there to address these concerns.
Yes, among all these changes, it was announced that the publisher of DC Comics, Jim Lee, who already went through a massive shakeup after his co-publisher Dan DiDio was abruptly fired earlier this year, would now be in a new position where he'd be more heavily involved in DC's multimedia department. Now, a lot of people looked at all these layoffs from their comics, as well as the guy in charge of their comics now being told to focus more on shows and movies, and they thought, so does this mean that the actual comics are in trouble? Among those asking these questions were The Hollywood Reporter, who in an interview with Jim Lee asked, what about the rumors that AT&T hates comics and wants to get out of the comics business? To which Jim Lee answered, I don't think they want to stop us from publishing comics. Comics serve a lot of different purposes, and one of them is it's a great way to incubate ideas and create the next great franchises. We want to continue that. Why would you want to stop that? Why would you want to stop creating great content that could be used across the greater enterprise? Now, Jim Lee said that to try and put fans' fears at rest. It didn't. Instead, it actually had the exact opposite effect because essentially this translated to the head of DC Comics, the guy who had been with that company and the person steering the ship for a decade now, saying that DC Comics were important because you could make movies from them. No talk of why comics themselves are important, no mention of the long legacy of these characters or of all the fans or the people working at these titles. No, just, well, they have to get their ideas for their movies and shows from somewhere, right? Except, here's the thing. No, they don't. AT&T and Warner Brothers don't need DC Comics to make DC movies or shows. Over the weekend, it was confirmed that the upcoming Flash movie would be based on the storyline Flashpoint. You know, kind of like how the third season of The Flash show was based on Flashpoint. And the Flash animated movie was based on Flashpoint. And the last Batman and Superman movie was based on The Dark Knight Returns and The Death of Superman. Two storylines that were over 2 decades old and had already been told in their animated universes multiple times. And those are the movies that actually take from the storylines. Many of their other movies and shows are completely original concepts that just happen to be starring these characters. And sometimes they share nothing with the comics outside of the names and basic premises. And even when they are similar to the comics, they don't actually need those comics. John Constantine keeps popping up in every form of DC's media empire. The Suicide Squad is getting another movie, and it was just announced they're going to get their very first video game. And yet, the first wave of book cancellations have been announced, and what were two of the titles DC knocked off? The John Constantine and Suicide Squad books. Yeah, Warner Brothers does not need these comics, and they know that. I know some people might be saying, well, what about Marvel? Their movies are different from the comics, so could Disney try and do this exact same thing with Marvel Comics? It's possible, especially now that AT&T has done it with DC, there is now a precedence for it, but I think it is less likely. Because yes, Marvel's movies are indeed different from the comics, but a big difference between Marvel's film universe and DC's film universe is that the Marvel films have a continuity. Meaning they will continue to move forward for the time being, which means that eventually they will need new stories. And as you can see from events in their cinematic universe such as Sam Wilson taking over for Captain America, Jane Foster becoming Thor, or the appearance of Kamala Khan as Ms. Marvel in her brand new Disney Plus series, they are actually having the older generation of these movies and shows make way for the newer stuff taken from newer stories in the comics. DC, on the other hand, well, the newest Batman movie is not going to be starring Ben Affleck. Instead, it's someone completely different. And it does not appear to tie into any of the other DC movies. And it is once again going to be about his earlier years as Batman, and is going to once again focus on Batman's trauma, because it's Batman, we can just keep making more Batman. Screw you, we do not need to come up with something new. We saw Uncle Ben die twice in the Marvel films, and we said, oh my god, I never want to see that again, and Disney came out and said, okay, we're never going to show that again. Batman's parents are going to continue to die over and over and over again until the end of time, because people will continue to pay to see Batman's parents die over and over and over again until the end of time. And after the success of the Joker film, I would not be shocked if everyone at Warner Bros. Was throwing out every idea they ever had for a cinematic universe to make way for more standalone films that don't connect to anything, and in all honesty, don't even really take that much from the comics. You can tell me that that Joker film was based on The Killing Joke all you want, it wasn't. It was completely its own thing that did not need to be based on anything from the comics, and Warner Brothers knows that. So when I see Jim Lee saying that they should keep the comics around to keep getting ideas for their movies, I don't see that as a mission statement, but more of a sales pitch. More of him trying to say to Warner Brothers and AT&T, hey, you guys know this is working for Disney, right? I mean, maybe you could give us that kind of attention? Maybe keep us around so you can keep picking us apart for stories? There's still some meat on these bones, guys, come on! And it's not even that strong of a sales pitch, because DC, I don't exactly know how you're going to try and sell the continuing growth and continuity of your universe when your universe doesn't have a continuing growth and continuity. We did a video on this a few months ago about how DC's timeline continuity have been a mess for almost a decade at this point, and I don't just mean because of all the reboots, although the fact that they're about to go through their third universal reboot in the span of 1 year really shouldn't be overlooked, but for years now, if you read DC, it became clear to you that the continuity of DC Comics is just whatever the writer of that particular book decided that they want it to be for that issue. Reading DC for years has felt like walking over cracking ice. There's no clear path forward, and your next step could be the one that just sinks everything. I mean, does anybody even remember 5G? Remember how people spent a year shouting, what's 5G? Is this the next big reboot? Where is it? When is it happening? Why won't you talk about 5G, Thorgy? Why haven't you made 10 videos about 5G already, Thorgy?
Yeah, I'll admit I might be a bit bitter about this issue.
But this was the next thing that everyone was talking about. This was the thing that everyone wanted information on, and now the guy who was in charge of that has been fired, and then the book that we thought was leading into it wasn't actually leading into it, but now there's a new book that's leading into it, but that one has already been delayed, and now 25% of DC's titles are being canceled, so who the hell even knows what's happening? In other words, you're trying to sell this idea of established stories and characters to AT&T when really you're just doing whatever you want. While AT&T is looking at their movies and shows and saying, yeah, we're just going to do whatever we want. It's like you're trying to sell water to someone whose house is on fire, and they say, sure, I'll take some of that. Then you just hold out a big flaming torch. That's the opposite of what you said that you were going to give us. And we already have that. So we're good.
These fears about DC moving away from producing comics were enhanced further when 2 interim editor-in-chiefs were named. One of those editor-in-chiefs having come almost exclusively from the world of DC's young adult novels. Now, don't get me wrong, DC's young adult novels have indeed been a big success for DC. They've been one of their bigger divisions over the past couple of years because that is indeed a huge market. A huge market that actually has a lot of interests that overlap with the comic book fans. So, hey, from a business standpoint, it's actually a smart move. But when people are afraid that you're going to stop making comics, and one of the people you have now put in charge of DC Comics comes from a division outside of their comics, it does raise people's concerns a bit more. And those concerns were raised even more when they announced that there would be a new general manager of DC Comics who was going to come from, quote, the world of esports. Ah, yes. Because when I think of something that is free from corporate greed and corruption, I think of esports. Sure can't wait for them to start putting loot boxes inside of each issue of DC Comics. For the people out there who don't really know anything about video games, that was a dump truck load of sarcasm.
So, to sum up, Jim Lee is trying to argue that DC still has value because you can mine it for IPs, while the new people appointed to be in charge of DC Comics come from their young adult department and video game esports. Literally none of this is putting our fears at ease. And I will admit that I do have an odd sense of schadenfreude because over the past several years, I've been arguing that comics need to start focusing more on digital sales and trades. And now Jim Lee says that they're going to do that exact thing. And I have watched as angry, doped-up nostalgia fiends have screamed and gnashed their teeth over DC and Marvel's young adult books and books that are focused on trade sales aimed at wider demographics, claiming that there isn't an actual audience there. So seeing that audience now turn out to be so large that those same angry YouTubers are now paranoid about being crushed under their growing power, yeah, there is a twisted sense of satisfaction that I get for a split second from all that. But I didn't think that when this happened, we'd also have to worry about a comic company being snapped out of existence because of it. I do fully believe that the things that Jim Lee talked about in that Hollywood Reporter article, things like focusing on digital books, focusing on trades, I do think that's the future of comics. I have said for a while, I think we're slowly moving in that direction. We're slowly beginning to move away from single issues that come out once a month. And when the country shut down due to the current pandemic, I said this could be the thing that really pushes us to that next step. And it looks like that is indeed what is happening. However, it looks like DC isn't really taking these steps to further expand the growth of their comics. They're taking it to slowly ease us off of their comics in general. If this succeeds, then great. This will be the new world of DC Comics, and I'm fine with that. But if it fails, do you think DC will go, oops, shouldn't have focused so much on digital sales and trades? No, they're going to say, oops, time to shrink DC Comics even more. It's kind of like when DC left Diamond. Now, when that happened, I applauded this because Diamond needed some competition because Diamond was a terrible, terrible company. So I was happy to see DC moving away from them. However, I fully knew that it might not work out for DC. But if it didn't work out, I was pretty certain that they would probably just go back to Diamond. But now, if this doesn't work out, AT&T will just use this as an excuse to cut back on their comics division even more.
Okay, it's time to address the question on everyone's mind. What could DC Comics have done to avoid this? What could they have possibly done to avoid this fate? Because, yeah, I'm not going to pretend like everyone is mad at DC, but if you look around the internet, there's a lot of people who are upset with DC. And I know that there are a lot of people upset at Marvel. There are a lot of people upset at every corner of the comic book industry right now, but DC has had some really clear problems over the past couple of years. It's been a lot easier to pinpoint the stuff that people are upset with when it comes to DC. For example, they've had some editors and publishers that people have really disagreed with, and that's turned away some of their fans. They've been focusing too much on one corner of their universe, so much so that we were actually going to do an episode talking about that exact issue, but screw it, there's way bigger things to talk about now. But by focusing so much on that one corner of your universe, you have been turning away fans of the other corners of your universe. And for almost a decade now, DC has been going down a darker and grittier path, which has turned away a lot of their longtime fans, a lot of their fans of the older, more lighthearted side of their universe. So much so that DC had to come in here with a soft reboot to remind everyone of all the stuff that they loved about their comics, only to go and pretty much undo all the good created by that soft reboot within the span of 2 years. So yes, DC has had problems. So what could they possibly have done to avoid all this? The answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah, you heard me. There is indeed a lesson to take away from this story, but it's not DC need to embrace what we loved about them. DC needed new management. DC shouldn't have made so many Batman books. No, none of those things mattered. At all. Because even though DC's sales numbers have been much lower than Marvel's over the past few years, the entire comic book industry's numbers have been going up, being the highest that they've been in a decade. Despite what many people online want to tell you, the comic book industry is actually doing well right now. So even if DC is behind Marvel, they're still doing okay. But let's say that they weren't behind Marvel. Let's say they weren't just doing okay. Let's say that DC's sales numbers doubled. No, forget that. Let's say that they tripled. So they were the highest selling comic book company of all time. They were experiencing the greatest success any comic book company had ever seen or would ever see. They still would have made up such a small fraction of AT&T's overall profits that they still would have been the first place AT&T would have turned to for layoffs. Print and digital comic sales in 2019 were estimated to have pulled in $1.2 billion, and DC made up 29% of those sales, meaning that it's estimated that they sold about $350 million of books. Sounds like a lot, but that's how much they sold, not how much they made. Because then you have to realize that that money didn't go into a comedically large money pit. No, instead, it goes towards paying your employees, printing new books, paying for real estate. And when all that's over with, it doesn't add up to that much money anymore. Now, how much money that means DC actually made is impossible to know because DC, just like every other comic book company out there, keeps their official numbers very secretive. But most people will tell you whatever money you make off of single individual comic book sales goes right back into printing single individual comics. There is actually very little profit from that. Most profit from comic books comes from things like their trades or, surprise, surprise, their side projects like, say, DC's young adult books. Meanwhile, AT&T made a consolidated revenue of more than $180 billion last year. That means the revenue from DC Comics made up 1/500th of AT&T's total revenue. DC Comics would have to increase their sales by 5 times to make up 1% of AT&T's annual sales figures. Yeah, that $350 million seems way smaller right now, doesn't it? I mean, when you compare that to everything else that its parent companies put out, it's pennies. That means that every single book that DC sold last year made up 1/3 of what the Aquaman movie made. $350 million to any of us is a life-changing amount of money. We could all go out and achieve all of our dreams, and we could change the world for the better and take care of everyone that we had ever known, and we would never have to worry about money ever again. And that is 1/500th of what AT&T made last year. That is such a small amount of money that they do not care at all about what happens to that company. And that brings me back to the lesson that needs to be learned. I know people have problems with DC. I know there are things people would like to have changed about DC. Hell, I know that I have problems with DC. Literally, my next 3 ideas for shows after this week are all talking about things that are happening at DC Comics. There is no shortage of nitpicks and critiques to make, but none of that would have mattered The lesson to be learned here is not this is what DC should have done. And anybody that goes online and tries to tell you, well, DC had only done this, if DC had only done that, if DC had only listened to me, internet guy, then they would be okay right now. That is someone who is just trying to manipulate you. That is someone who is just trying to prey on your fears in this delicate time. Someone who is just trying to come in here at this moment in DC's history and trying to manipulate it to make them seem right and make them seem like they're in charge and they know everything and you should listen to them. Those people are wrong because that is not the lesson here. The lesson is not this is what DC should have done. The lesson is giant massive corporations like AT&T do not care about you. Nobody working at AT&T who made these decisions actually read comics. Hell, they probably don't even watch any of the DC movies. And none of them stop to think about how many thousands and thousands of people read DC Comics and how much DC Comics means to a wider audience out there. None of them stop to think about that. None of them stop to think about all the people working at DC and how many of them were probably working for them over in New York and picked up and changed their entire lives to move out to LA for them. None of them thought about that. Somebody in a boardroom with a suit and tie on wasn't reading a DC comic one day and then just got fed up and threw it to the ground and said, there's too much Batman in these books, and I don't like what Bendis did on the Superman books, and why did they replace Vertigo with Black Label? Time to make some layoffs. No, someone in a boardroom looked at a bunch of numbers on a chart and said, that one's tiny, get rid of it. And because of how huge AT&T is, because of how much media they control, because of how much money they make, even if DC Comics managed to increase their sales by 5 times, an amount that no comic book company would ever be able to hit, AT&T still would have looked at that and said, that one's tiny, get rid of it. That's it.
Okay, now before I go, you have to listen carefully. In 2020, there is going to be... Hello? Hello? That little bastard hung up on me! Oh, damn you, past Aaron! You screwed me again! I hope you too have to live through 2020! Wait. Screw it. Well, failed to change the timeline, everybody. So, that brings us to the end of our show today. And I know I like to typically leave you guys with some bit of positivity or some hope, but, yeah, I got nothing here, folks. It's just some dark, dark times. You want my recommendation? Go support some indie developers. Go out there and support some indie writers, some independent companies. Because, you know, if they get support, then they just have to answer to their publishers. They don't have to worry about a giant, massive corporation coming in here and closing them down. Find some writers that you really enjoy and back them wherever they do their stuff online. If I can make one specific spotlight here of my own, you guys have heard me talk numerous times about Spencer and Locke and how good that book is. Well, the creator of that series currently has a Kickstarter going on right now for a series called Oz, which is another reimagining of his of a classic franchise, which if you read Spencer and Locke, you know he is really good at that. So he's got a Kickstarter for that going right now. I will leave a link to that in the description down below. This was probably not the episode he would want me to promote his book on, considering everything else going on in this show. But, you know, I want to make sure that I got the word out on that. And also, as I said, I really do think that right now it is the best time to support some indie books. In fact, if you run a comic book store and someone is asking for recommendations, aim them towards some indie stuff. That is honestly going to be the best thing for your business right now. That is, if people can actually come into your place of business right now because of, you know, all the other stuff going on in the world. How many more months are left in this year? Too many. All right, well, bye, everybody. We'll be back next week with something much more uplifting and something much better. I'm kidding. As I said, I have 3 more episodes written about all the problems going on in DC, and I gotta do something with them.